This is a short little lecture to go along with the PowerPoints that you have. So if you want to follow along, I'll put in some notes on the board. Mainly we'll go over the PowerPoint for economy and income security and add some stuff not in the book. So the main questions that you see here on your PowerPoint not necessarily have answers or solutions, but you can see why is it difficult to arrange collective action institutions to support the widely agreed upon idea that citizens should not fall below a basic income floor. So basically, how do we keep people afloat without harming others, and how much effort do we put into keeping people above a certain level of income without harming others? Moving down a little bit, is it equitable for some citizens not to pay income taxes? Is it okay for some of the poor not to, or for some corporations not to have to pay taxes? And then in terms of Social Security, we've mentioned this before, can the Social Security program be redesigned to provide benefits more equitably and more affordably? Should we privatize the system or not? All of these questions can kind of be in the back of your head as we go through the lecture on economy and income security. So the next slide, good and bad economies. Essentially what makes for a good versus a bad economy, and there's a lot to consider, and it certainly depends upon one's opinion whether we're in a good or bad economy based upon indicators. Some that they look at are economic growth, the employment rate, inflation, and balance of trade. First, economic growth, basically when the economy is growing, the country's producing valuable goods and selling them at a large rate. During a recession, there's either a slowing of the economic growth or the selling of products and services in the economy, or at times even a negative growth rate. Growth is usually attributed to improvements in education and technology, the abilities of the human resources, or making it easier to produce the goods that we sell out on the domestic and global markets. Additionally, if we find more resources like oil, we see this with fracking, the idea is that those resources that we find and use as inputs into producing our products increases the economy. Generally speaking, the way economists will initially look at economic growth is through GDP, or gross domestic product. That's essentially the value of the goods and services produced by a country. It is labeled GDP. When you look at GDP, you have to account for inflation, especially if you're looking at the change in GDP over time. So if you go back to 1990, look at what the dollar could buy in 1990, or the cost of goods in 1990. So for example, a bottle of Coke might have cost in 1990 75 cents, 85 cents, maybe $1. Now go to 2017. Does that dollar from 1990 have the same purchasing power as 2017? Well, no. Because we know that a bottle of Coke now is somewhere like $1.50. And that's due to just a natural increase in prices or inflation. We've not suffered from mass inflation in the U.S. recently, but it is something that you must look at. So if you look at 1990's GDP, so if you look at GDP, and it's much higher than this, but for simplicity, say it was $5 billion, and then in 2017, GDP was $5 billion, I would argue that the economy has been in recession or has declined, because $5 billion in 1990 is a lot more money than $5 billion in 2017. So when you account for inflation or the natural increase in the prices of goods, $5 billion in 1990 may equal, or should equal, something much higher than $5 billion today. Maybe that due to inflation, maybe 3%, $5 billion, let's see, maybe it's 8.5 billion. Okay? And that you have to check the numbers, but maybe $5 billion in GDP in 1990 is equal to $8.5 billion in GDP today. So anytime you're looking at money over time, you have to take into account inflation. When you do take into account inflation with GDP or any kind of measure, you get the real GDP, and that's accounting for inflation. Anytime you take the GDP and divide by the population, that's per capita GDP. So the United States produces X billions of dollars or trillions of dollars in GDP. Divide that by the population. Essentially, the per capita GDP is how much GDP per person exists. So that is a per person measure. Per person. And is usually a better measure than just raw gross domestic product because you have to account for the country's size. And when you account for inflation and you do it on a per person basis, probably the best measure of GDP is real per capita GDP. I mean, moving on, the employment rate is often also used as an indicator of the economy. We hear about it a lot in the news. The unemployment rate naturally, by definition, is the number of people that are not employed in some sort of work. The unemployment rate definition looks at people that are willing to work and have looked for work. So these are people on the job market. Usually in economic growth, unemployment's low. In recession, naturally unemployment goes up. What the unemployment rate is a bit deflated and hides some numbers. The key with the unemployment rate is that it's individuals that are willing to work and that have looked for work in a certain amount of time. The unemployment rate does not include what are called discouraged workers, which are either those that are unwilling to work or unable to work due to disability or sickness, and also importantly, individuals that are discouraged and have not looked for work. Maybe they've figured, I can't get a job, I don't have the skills, so they've dropped out of the job market and they are no longer considered part of the market pool, and so these individuals are not reflected in the unemployment rate. So even though an unemployment rate of 4 to 5% seems to be what you should strive for, usually that number when you include discouraged workers is going to be a little bit higher. So anytime you see on the news when they report unemployment rates at 4.5%, that does not include discouraged workers. Now these are hard to measure, but it's something to know that the unemployment rate as we know it is a bit deflated because we don't include discouraged workers. Inflation. Generally speaking, when the economy is good, inflation should be held in check. Inflation is basically how much a dollar can purchase. It's the purchasing power of the currency that you're using. Basically, when inflation is going way up, then the things that you want to buy cost more. They cost more dollars. When inflation goes down, what you want costs less. Countries that have high inflation, for example, we'll go back to the Coca-Cola example. Here in the U.S., $1.50 is roughly a bottle of Coke. If the U.S. suffers from high inflation, for example, if the U.S. prints a lot more dollars and puts the money supply, a large money supply out onto the market, then there's more dollars flooding the market. Producers are going to need more to make a profit, and so that's going to be reflected in the cost. And with high inflation, a Coke may go up to, say, $4 for a Coke with high inflation. Just remember, inflation's the increase in prices of goods over time. Generally speaking, we want to see inflation kept in check. And then with trade, I'm not a macroeconomist, so trade balances are not my forte, but generally speaking, you want to export more than you import. And you want to export more finished products than raw products. And you can learn more about the economies of Latin America and how their exports are raw materials and cheap goods, rubber, fruits and vegetables that don't bring a lot of money back to the economy, and the U.S. exports high-end goods, electronics, vehicles, etc., that use those imports from other countries to produce really expensive goods. So generally speaking, you want your balance of trade to be in your favor. You want to export more than you import. It means that you're producing more in your country that's going out of your borders, out to other countries, which means more jobs.